Hello, I'm Sebastian Michael, and this, unsurprisingly, is this Saturday's sonnet. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines. By chance, all nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe, or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. I say unsurprisingly because, of course, this is Sonnet 18, one of the best loved, most famous, most often recited, most often used, quoted, invoked sonnets in the English language. Some people have argued this isn't really a love poem at all, that it's really all about the writer. And I think there's something to be said about that. But it is, in particular, of course, a piece of poetry that declares its devotion to the person who is being spoken to, our young man. And in this place where it is now, it marks a completion of almost of a cycle, you could say. We've had the procreation sonnets. Up until now, the poet has not written a single one of these sonnets without telling the young man, you should go forth and procreate and have a child. And here now, with Sonnet 18, for the first time, he abandons all talk of having children. Not only does he abandon all talk of having children, he goes one step further. He now contradicts himself exactly, whereby only 2 sonnets ago, in number 16, he said, "But wherefore do not you a mightier way make war upon this bloody tyrant time, and fortify yourself in your decay, with means more blessed than my barren rhyme?" And then goes on to say, well, if you have children, then this will be a more effective way to stay young and beautiful and to continue your life, your existence, than me scribbling away with my barren rhyme, with my rhyme that cannot produce any offspring, that cannot produce any flowers, that is barren. Now in Sonnet 18, this is no longer the case. Now in Sonnet 18, it is my verse, it is my rhyme, it is my writing that makes you live forever, that makes you live eternally. You can now forget having children. Something magnificent has happened. The poet is not only asserting his presence, but he's doing so in an unbelievably confident way, saying, I am the one who will make you immortal. And he's right. We are still talking about this young man today. We don't know absolutely certain who he is, but whoever he is, his spirit lives, his beauty lives in our minds. We know that the effect he's had on the poet will continue to live until civilization is no longer either in existence or no longer capable of reading and understanding Shakespeare. And that's incredible. And this is why this sonnet is so terribly exciting, because not only is it a beautiful piece of poetry, which of course it is, but also it marks the completion of this first cycle. We are now into something new. We're no longer in the procreation sonnet. We're now in the territory, in the landscape. We're now in the world of love. And I, the poet, am now smitten by a beautiful young man who I now cannot even compare to a summer's day, because you, the beautiful man, outshine in perfection even a summer's day. It's maybe one of the most loved poems and sonnets of Shakespeare's, also because it's actually really easy to understand. So what does it mean, Sonnet 18? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. This is a big statement to make, because in Shakespeare's day, remember, we don't have central heating, do we? We don't have electricity. A summer's day is a good thing in England of the late 1500s, the 1590s. At this time, in the late 16th century, a summer's day is a wonderful thing, because winter is long and cold and horrible and dark. And so if you say to somebody, you are more lovely and more temperate than a summer's day, you are giving exquisite praise to this person. And note, perhaps, if I may use the word note, interesting is the fact that, again, we are no longer just simply talking about the man's beauty. Remember when we said with Sonnet 10, there's a key change, and how the Sonneteer, how the poet, how Shakespeare brings himself into it, and how he calls the young man gracious and kind. This is no longer just about appearance, this is also about presence and about personality. And now this continues, thou art more lovely and more temperate. Our poet is smitten, our poet is in love, and that's what makes this sonnet so absolutely wonderful. I am vastly digressing from the translation, aren't I? But thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake. I don't need to translate this, do I? Obviously, you are lovelier and more, and even more moderate in your extremes, more temperate than a summer's day. Even though a summer's day is something pretty perfect in England. Rough winds, but now we get explanation. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. Clear what that means. And summer's lease hath all too short a date. The term of summer, the duration of summer is all too short. And there's an interesting little deviation here from actually the core topic. The core topic is a summer's day, and here he does a little bit of almost like maybe subconscious psychology, where he says, well, we are very familiar with this when we say something, oh, this can't last. It's wonderful, but it can't last, obviously. So very often when we don't want to get too attached to something, we start pointing out its flaws. Yes, of course, a holiday in the Caribbean will be absolutely delightful, but, there are jellyfish, of course. So, I'm not so sure that you will be absolutely happy there. We diminish something that we can't maybe have in its absolute perfection. Sometime too hot, the eye of heaven shines. The eye of heaven is the sun, and sometimes it's too hot to be comfortable. And often it is gold complexion dimmed, because there's clouds travelling past, and so it's not actually that sun. It may be a summer's day, but there are clouds. It's imperfect. And every fair from fair sometime declines. Again, it can't last, it won't last forever. It may be beautiful now, but every fair from fair sometime declines. Again, this hasn't strictly got anything to do with the summer's day, but this is an observation that even if it is absolutely lovely now, it can't last forever. So perfection and durability and the ability to last forever, they are coupled here in this thought. The fact that something cannot last forever, isn't eternally durable, makes it less perfect. And every fair from fair sometime declines by chance or nature's changing course, untrimmed. Again, it helps us sometimes to remind ourselves a little bit of the time that Shakespeare lives in, because I go on about how contemporary these sonnets feel, but it's worth bearing in mind that Shakespeare lives in a very, very rough and ready world in which there is extraordinary violence being perpetrated against people by the state, for example, in which you can be hung, drawn and quartered as a form of execution if you are a traitor, for example. Your life expectancy as a man is something like 30 years in London. You do exceptionally well if you reach the age that Shakespeare himself reached. So chance is a big factor. There's no penicillin, there are no antibiotics, there's virtually no science the way we understand it today. If you fall ill, even with just the flu or some bug, it's very likely, it's as likely as not to kill you. And there's the plague all the time. Every year or two we have to leave town because there's the plague. The theatres are shut. Chance and nature's changing course, the uncertainties of just the natural course of events, they are very significant, very, very powerful agents in the life of an Elizabethan young man. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. This owest is a little bit confusing for us. It sounds a bit like that thou owest, as if as in that you owe. It's not the meaning. Thou owest is that thou ownest. The abbreviation, the letters that are taken out there are an N as well as an E. So you, unlike a summer's day, unlike everything that's fair in the world, unlike everything else in the world, you will go on forever. Your beauty shall not fade. Your eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor lose your beauty, your fair, your beauty. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, nor will death personified, this happens a lot, like time is personified, death here thought of as a figure, nor will death be able to brag that you are subject to him, that you wander in his shade. If you wander in his shade, that means you walk in the shade of something greater and bigger than you. Death will not be able to say so. When in eternal lines to time thou growest, when in lines which are eternal, these lines that I'm writing, you grow to time, you grow older. There may be quite a few editors point at there being also perhaps a reference to the lines of progeny, but we can't be entirely certain. There may be a double meaning. That's not unusual for Shakespeare. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. This is a bold statement, isn't it? This is an assertion saying that these verses that I'm now writing for you today, they will live forever, and through them you will live forever. Or at least, if not forever, then for as long as there are people who can read. And so in our quest to find out what the story is behind these sonnets, we have a gem here, of course. A gem that doesn't actually tell us all that much about the young man. It tells us a lot about the poet and where he is at in relation to this young man. Something clearly has changed. Now, it is possible to suggest that maybe these sonnets aren't all written to the same young man. Maybe this is completely different because it's written to a completely different young man. This is in theory, again, possible. But if, as we suggested in episode 2, in the face of uncertainty, likelihood is our friend, then I think going with the likely, or the most likely, or at any rate, to my mind, more likely scenario, and in brackets, we don't always know what is more likely or less likely. We just sometimes make up a conjecture even about that. But from our own experience, we know that the type of relationship we have with the same person changes. And so if these different sonnets were written to different men, then these different young men would have to have quite similar, in fact, quite strikingly similar and quite specific characteristics, which come up every so often. And the likelihood of that seems to be somewhat limited, that one poet would write a series of different sonnets to a series of different characters who are all very similar in their characteristics. And so the probability of these being various different characters is actually, I think, comparatively small. They all point to one person who has a set of characteristics that keep being reiterated and being described. Not so much in this particular sonnet, because in this particular sonnet we compare this man's loveliness to a summer's day. But that then means that if we are talking all the way through to the same young man, then it is interesting to ask the question, what's changing here? How is it that I, the poet, now am clearly in love? I clearly adore this young man. There is no doubt he is adorable. He is lovelier than a summer's day, and the summer's day is something pretty amazing in Elizabethan England. So what's changed? Well, it is of course entirely human and entirely normal for a relationship to change over time. If I, as a freelance writer, I get asked to write things now and then for other people, rarely sonnets, although I could write a sonnet, so if you need a sonnet, then maybe I'm your man. But I get tasked every now and then with writing some words for somebody. And say I went to a creative studio in London here, and I got asked to write some words for some job, and the person I'm working with, let's say in this case not them writing these sonnets for this man, but say there's a young guy who works in the studio in this creative studio, and he's got a bit of a reputation. Maybe he's quite well known. He's maybe extremely good looking, and at first I'm not so impressed because I think he's a bit up his own. And then at one point the person who's commissioning me to do the work says, "Oh well, you need to work with Jeff. He's the account manager." And so, "Oh well, I have to work with Jeff now." So you go and talk to him, and you realise, actually, Jeff is a nice guy. All this posturing that I've been seeing, all this reputation he has, that's not actually the real Jeff. And then you work with him, and you discuss a bit what you're doing, and you create something together, and lo and behold, you realise that actually I rather fancy Jeff a little bit now. And then you realise that Jeff is adorable, he's lovely, and suddenly you're in love, and you start speaking a very different language. This is possible. This is not an unusual scenario in the human frame of experience, that we have a fairly distanced, a fairly, maybe even slightly skeptical, maybe even critical, at any rate a distanced relationship with somebody, and then that changes. And it's possible, I'm not saying this, I can't say with any certainty that this is what's happening here, but it's possible, of course, that our poet, William Shakespeare, is undergoing a change very fundamental in the relationship with the young man. And that poses the question, why? How come? Where did it start, and where is it now? And I think where it is now and where it is going, we can tell. It goes from telling the young man to produce children, to putting himself in the sonnet and say, if you don't do it for yourself, then do it for love of me. And then by 15 already, which comes as a couple with 16, so although in 15 itself I don't mention procreation specifically, it's very much themed to growth and plants increase and what have you. And it's also quite suggestive, actually, I think. But then it says, well, in number 16, "But wherefore do not you a mightier way make war?" I've already mentioned that. If I compare the ability of my pen with the ability of your offspring to make you live forever. And in number 16, my pen still loses out. There's a mightier way than my pen to make you live forever. By 17, he says, well, who will believe my verse? If I go on and on about you, people will say, well, this is just a rant by an old man who fancies a young person. And then goes on to say, well, if you had a child, then not only would these verses exist, but a child would also exist. You have both, the best of both worlds almost. And then by 18, now we're at the point where I, as the poet, say, don't even bother with procreating, because you now have me, and I can write verses for you that make you live forever. And incidentally, Shakespeare would of course have made our lives infinitely easier had he'd addressed this young man of his love. Now we can say of his at least adoration, infatuation, it seems like, if he'd addressed him at least once by name. But then where would our mystery be? And it's the mystery that makes these sonnets, of course, so incredibly exciting as well. And I think that's probably all I really want to say about Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day. It doesn't need a lot of explaining, really it doesn't. It needs celebrating as a piece of writing, and it needs enjoying, and it certainly has a position as the as the sonnet in the series that changes everything completely. We now have a poet, properly speaking, from the heart to a young man, and no longer taking seriously whatever task, whatever intention was behind the procreation sonnets. They have been abandoned. Before I go, I want to also touch on another sonnet, though, number 20, very briefly, if I may, because number 20 is also really quite interesting, and it does something that may help us understand these sonnets and the story, a possible story behind them. Because in this, in Sonnet 20, our poet William Shakespeare says, "A woman's face with nature's own hand painted hast thou, the master mistress of my passion." And he goes on about talking how this man, this young man, has many qualities that a woman has, and he doesn't have many qualities that a woman has. Shakespeare is a little bit disparaging about some of the qualities women have. He really doesn't like painted faces much, but be that as it may, this is really interesting because it's really quite specific. Not every young man of a marriageable age in Shakespearean Elizabethan England has a woman's face, has a woman's gentle heart. This is a description of somebody who has an androgyny about him, who looks and comes across as not particularly macho, not particularly robust in his male testosterone-driven attributes. And I think this is interesting because it tells us a little bit of who this man is. It's very specific. It's not generic, it's not general, it doesn't apply to everybody. It applies to only really probably quite a small number of people who also fit the other criteria we have identified now in somebody we're looking for. We're looking for somebody in whose life the mother is quite important, whose father is no more. We know of his father, you had a father, you don't have a father anymore. We know he's of great status, he has a house to maintain, and he looks a little bit like a girl, like a woman. He looks like a young woman. And then Shakespeare goes on to pun quite intensively, quite on this young man being pricked by nature, being equipped with something that to him, Shakespeare, doesn't really have too much of a purpose. And this is really interesting because in this sonnet, Shakespeare addresses more, not quite head-on, a little bit tangentially, a little bit punning, and a little bit with humour, the slightly vexing fact that he's in love with a young man. He doesn't make a big deal of it, and he certainly doesn't seem to suggest that loving a young man is wrong, but he at this point, and this is also interesting, he at this point quite specifically says that since she, nature, pricked thee out, you, the young man, out for women's pleasure, make of that what you will, it's obvious, mine be thy love, and thy love's use, their treasure. At this point, Sonnet 20, within two down from Sonnet 18, so I compared it to Sonnet 8, the poet is still certainly talking about the young man as somebody whom he can love and whose love he receives in return. But the pleasure of his love is women's at this point, still, at any rate. That's interesting. Because again, it marks sort of where we are at in the proceedings, and we will find out, of course, as we go along, whether this will remain to be the case. Many editors suggest this is a purely platonic relationship. I'm not going to make any pronouncements on this because we're only at Sonnet 20 here, but it tells us something that's of interest to us and that is useful because it once more narrows down our already quite shallow, we called it fathomable pool of possible contenders for the role of young man. He looks like a girl. He has a woman's face. And we know that at this stage, I have a passion for this man, but I don't as yet either have or see as likely to get a physical relationship with the young man. The moment I'm saying that sex is for women to enjoy with you, I get your love. That's interesting. It's fascinating. This is quite explicit here. It's not particularly mysterious language. He's not particularly hiding any of this. He's just putting it out there for us to understand. It's very easy to understand. And I think that's probably enough, right, for the moment. We've had one of the most wonderful sonnets this week to enjoy, but there are many more beautiful sonnets to come. And so remember, love is the power, and see you next Saturday.